The case for reparations. There is general abundance and a high standard of living in the ex-colonial countries, in particular the West, basically Europe, UK, Canada, USA, joined by Australia and New Zealand. Typical GDP per capita ranges from $30,000 to $65,000 per year in the developed countries, compared to only about $2,000 to $4,000 in East Africa or India. The colonials' extracted wealth formed the colonized countries from the rest of the world, inflicting great suffering and loss of millions or hundreds of million lives. There have been reparations in place for decades, but to a very small extent compared to what was extracted and the suffering caused. Reparations that exist are mainly under the UN trade preferences for developing countries. These trade preferences set up decades ago still exist. They are mainly via A. European GSP and GSP Plus schemes. B. UK Developing Countries Trading Scheme, DCTS. C. Japan, Canada, and other donors programs. The least developed countries, LDCs, get duty-free, quota-free access, which is the strongest and most reliable benefit. Larger developing countries, example, India, Vietnam, Kenya, get conditional, partial preferences, but these are narrowing in practice. The US has effectively abandoned GSP. India and other countries no longer benefit, and punitive tariffs are applied under Sections 232 and 301. The result is that preferences exist but are uneven, conditional, and weaker than they were historically. Documented below are the historical extraction and reparations context. European colonialism caused massive economic, social, and demographic harm. Forced labor, slavery, genocide, famines, and resource extraction. Economic structures in colonies were reshaped to benefit Europe. Wealth from colonies fueled industrialization and long-term prosperity in Europe. Settler colonies, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, displaced indigenous peoples and retained land and resources. The colonials extracted wealth from the colonized countries from the rest of the world, inflicting great suffering and loss of millions or hundreds of million lives. To elucidate his further, the genocide in the Americas, including Canada and South America, was vetted and encouraged by a papal bull passed by Pope Alexander in 1493, stating that non-European non-Christians were inferior subhuman, hence the land, livestock, property was free to be taken or colonized. This led to a huge plunder and takeover of land and resources alongside the genocide of the native Andeans, native Indians, native inhabitants. In Africa, the populations were subjected to slavery, forced labor, rape, torture, and murder. As an example, the count is about 10 million in the Republic of Congo at the hands of King Leopold of Belgium to extract rubber mainly. In Kenya, documentation of forced labor, torture, land grabbing, etc. surfaced later, and some reparations were made by Britain. India was the jewel of the crown of the British Empire. When the British arrived a few hundred years ago, India was the wealthiest trading nation with 27% of world GDP, with China having a similar share of the world GDP. The two countries accounted for half the world trade. By the time the British left, India's share of the world GDP was a mere 4%. The British plundered the country, starting with the East India Trading Company, backed by the British Army and Navy, and then taken over by the Crown and government. A policy of divide and rule was used to win alliances with different factions, sometimes using religion. Pitting one against the other and buying loyalty helped propel their conquest. Indians were used to assist the British to take over trade and governance, recruiting local Indians into the army, and as indentured laborers was common. Superior armaments like cannons were deployed to assist the takeover. Famines were created, millions starved, literacy rate dropped. This was accompanied by illegal or unfair taxation, land grabbing, extraction of goods, transfer of trade, sometimes using cruel methods. Indentured labor was used, exported to places like East Africa, to help build the railways, as an example, Caribbean, Mauritius, etc. Indentured labor was also used to replace slavery. Indian soldiers helped Britain and its allies win the world wars. 2.5 million soldiers were deployed, the largest volunteer or forced army in the world. Reparations have not been implemented seriously. Aid and trade preferences are minor mitigations, not restitution. Additionally, the modern United States trade aggression has accentuated the unfairness and disparity. Punitive tariffs, withdrawal of preferences, and unilateral trade policies reinforce post-colonial economic asymmetries. This behavior strengthens reparations arguments, showing that structural harm is ongoing, not just historical. Unfair trade practices can be those of extracting raw materials at low prices, adding value, and selling back or to others, or politically motivated sanctions and tariffs, etc. Placing everything in a quantitative perspective. The estimated colonial extraction and unequal value flows. India under Britain, $45 to $65 trillion. Global South, modern unequal exchange, $62 to $152 trillion. Value of enslaved labor in US, approximately $97 trillion. Compare that with the official development assistance from major donors since 1960. Annual, approximately $200 billion plus currently. Cumulatively over 60 plus years, approximately $9 to $12 trillion. Hence, aid is orders of magnitude smaller than the value historically extracted, highlighting the scale of ongoing economic imbalance. The key implications are: trade preferences and aid do not constitute reparations. They are partial, conditional, and politically mediated. True reparations would need to include financial restitution, long-term, binding, debt cancellation, structural trade reform, permanent duty-free access, technology and IP transfers, institutional power redistribution, IMF, World Bank, WTO. Current international law does not enforce reparations, but pressure could build through collective state action, African Union, Caribbean Community, BRICS, strategic litigation, the UN or IMF, countermeasures against trade coercion. In conclusion, colonial extraction and modern trade inequalities created massive structural harm. Reparations alone cannot compensate for the suffering and lives lost, especially in the genocides against the native indigenous Indians of America and Canada, or Aborigines of Australia and New Zealand. Current aid and trade measures barely scratch the surface, and reparations remain an unresolved, legally and morally grounded demand, especially in light of ongoing United States trade policies that perpetuate the imbalance. Furthermore, the trillions of dollars spent on wars would be better utilized in reparations.